So what we're going to do today. Ideally, you were able to watch the video from our last class. Don't tell me if you didn't, my heart can't take it. But we ended that class with a bit of an exercise that I think is actually very beneficial to pretty much everyone. And I'm going to attempt the same thing with you now. So, what we're going to do, I want you got to have some way to write this stuff down. It doesn't have to be pen and paper. You can type it if you want, whatever you're comfortable with, okay? Because it's for you. But here's what I want from you, and I'm going to explain it, but I'm going to tell you what we're doing first. I want your text, like the title of whatever text you're doing, okay? Hopefully you feel like you know that by now. And then a 2 to 3 sentence summary of that text. So not super long, not super complicated, but if we've never seen it or read it or whatever, what's it about? And then lastly, what makes your text your text? And here's what I mean by that. So last time, because we're using Die Hard as a class text, right? We talked about all of the things you would expect to see in a movie like that. It's an 80s action movie. So you expect guns and explosions and violence and breasts, right? All those movies have that. I grew up on Jean-Claude Van Damme. All those movies have that, every time. And it can be beneficial, on the one hand, to highlight that stuff, right? You know whatever genre your text is in, you kind of know what to expect from a movie like that. Or whatever show, again, whatever you're talking about. You know what to expect a lot of the time. I'm not saying you can't write about that stuff at all, but imagine a paper, if you were writing about Die Hard, which you are not, but imagine a paper, hello,
What's up?
where you turned it in and the whole paper was about all the ways that Die Hard is an action movie. No thank you, right? We don't need that paper to exist. But that can help you set that stuff aside. And what makes Die Hard, what makes your text, is everything else. And we've talked about this. So like, the fact that John McClane is an everyman is pretty atypical, right? The fact that he comes to LA to save his family literally, but also save his family figuratively. He wants to reconcile with his wife. He has to figure out, like, their marriage is changing and he has to kind of come to grips with that. You know what I'm saying? Not a lot of action movies doing stuff like that. So that stuff that is very specific to that text is what we actually want to focus on, right? And I'd like you to do something similar with your thing, okay? So to recap, but also to recap for everyone else, your text, whatever the title is, okay, jot that down. 2 to 3 sentence summary, just plot. This is what happens, this is what it's about, okay? And then the last part, we'll take a little more time. What makes your text your text? What makes it different from other things that are kind of like it, you know? What's your text?
It's called Ruthless.
Ruthless?
It's a Tyler Perry movie.
Okay, I think I've heard of it. He's made like 30,000 movies. So
Yeah.
Okay. What's it about?
I'm not sure what I wrote.
Sure. With your chest though, please.
This TV series is about a cult of black women, men, and children. They all live under the control of the highest, who is homosexual. The children of the cult are said to be the children of the highest, and not many people know he's gay. And they're expected to obey the highest, and the women are to obey the men.
Okay. That's unfortunately a pretty standard cult setup, actually. A lot of cults run that way. Strangely. Okay. So this is the show.
Yeah.
Is it still ongoing?
Yes, but
Okay.
it's only 1 season.
Okay. My first bit of advice always, anytime somebody does a show, how long are the episodes? You don't know?
No, I just watch. I don't really.
Um,
I don't really.
I mean, I would assume they're like a half hour, but it could be an hour.
Yeah, it's somewhat.
Huh.
No.
Well, that's going to matter for the next thing I say, which is for shows, I usually advise people to do no more than like 2 or so episodes, because you can't take on the whole show. There's too much, okay? And if they're a half hour a piece, well, then maybe you can do 3 episodes, right? That's an hour and a half. If they're an hour long, though, 2 is probably a good stopping point. But all that out of the way, what do you feel like makes your text your text? Does anything stand out to you as like maybe a little bit different, or I'll just leave it there because I've never seen it.
Well, to me, yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
It's like, I just watched it.
Yeah.
And
It's on Netflix or something, I assume?
BET.
Okay.
It was like, the women, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't like when like women have to do what men say.
Yeah,
And that's what really stood out to me.
sure. Is it set in the modern day? Does it seem like?
Yeah.
Well, like, cause I mean, there's weird markers. So, like, is anyone pulling a telephone off a wall, or does it? You know what I'm saying? Like, that would tell you it's older. I'm just curious.
Oh, no, okay.
Okay. Do they have maybe like TVs or anything? Do they?
Not in the cult.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's kind of. I mean, okay. So there's a couple things I can kind of gloss from what you're saying, and again, part of this is I've never seen the show. I couldn't tell you the last show I actually got to watch. One thing that's kind of interesting to me, kind of stands out to me. On the one hand, it's a dramatization of cult life. That'd be a fun bumper sticker. Cult life, and it's just like people in chains. Anyway, why are these people in this cult? Do they go into that, or why does this guy run it? Do they ever? Is there like a main character, or is it just everybody?
The heist,
He's the main character.
like, yeah, like over.
Does it ever delve into like his motivations for doing any of this, or how he gets people to join?
Cause, yeah, it does. You just have to watch it.
But I can't, dog. All right.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I can explain it more in paper.
Okay. Well, one thing that does strike me, and I'm making some assumptions here, but I feel like they're valid, and if they're not, please correct me. We're talking about, it's a cult narrative, and we do have that. We have narratives for pretty much everything these days, and when you gave us kind of the rundown of how it works, that does sound like a lot of cults that have actually existed. You have one guy, it's usually a man, who runs the show, and he's obviously in charge of everyone, but he's almost seen as like a messiah type figure. There's almost always a religious underpinning. Is there one here, I assume? Some kind of weird, yeah. That's pretty standard. The fact that the guy has his pick of the women is pretty standard, although here you say he's gay, but there's it seems there's a...
I just think, like, he's trying to cover up that he's gay.
Well, and that's
By
interesting.
saying the children are his.
That's interesting. So again, what I'm kind of saying there is, if that wasn't the case, if he were heterosexual and was having sex with all these women, that would be standard according to the narrative. And it's not. I mean, it's like gross, but it's not. It's not as much worth talking about because it's like that's how cults work a lot of the time. What's interesting here, I agree with you. Perhaps it seems like he's kind of using that narrative to shield himself, his sexuality. So the immediate question is, why does he feel like he has to do that, right? Does he feel like, and these are questions, I do not know, does he feel like he has to do that to maintain power in this scenario? If so, why? Does he feel like he has to be seen in a certain way, and part of that is heterosexually? And again, if so, why, right? Like these big questions, I think you absolutely have to investigate, because that's a weird thing to pretend. How many kids are we talking about, ballpark? Like double digits?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird thing to pretend to do, right? So that tells us it must be very important for some reason. That would be item number 1 on my list. Number 2, the biggest thing that stands out to me, I'm assuming, given the details you've given me, I mean, Tyler Perry is well known for, if not all black cast, then predominantly. So this is probably, I mean, predominantly an all black cast, so an all black cult. that's kind of atypical. When you hear about cults, either real cults or dramatized cults, it's a bunch of crazy white people. Almost always, right? Almost always. And that's weirdly interesting. Like, I'm not sure what to do with it, because again, I haven't seen the show, but I feel like there's got to be a reason. Tyler Perry's a smart guy. He has to have a reason for wanting to make. Like, I'll put it to you in a very silly way to kind of highlight what I'm thinking about. Surely Tyler Perry didn't sit down and say, you know what? It's 2020. It's all about equal representation. We need a cult show too, right? That's kind of goofy, right? It's not a black cult show just to have a black cult show, right?
So you're saying it's like meaning behind it?
I think so. I'm assuming so. So then the question again becomes, and this might be a more constructive way to put it, are we saying something specifically about black culture, right? Because that can and does function differently. The cult setup is a weird one, but again, it's so hard because I haven't seen the damn show. But if it functions at all like a typical cult does, and it sounds like it does in a lot of ways.
This is my first time hearing about a cult.
Okay, well, you're young. You got time. But we have them a lot. Some of the more famous ones, there's the Heaven's Gate. Some of those people still kicking around. When I was a kid, we had the Davidians, which they followed a guy. They called themselves that because they followed a guy named David Koresh in Texas. So they called themselves the Davidians from David. It's not very creative. There's a famous one in oh man, I just forgot the name of it. There's all kinds of Jonestown. There's all kinds of documentaries about it, but it's always usually crazy white people who glom around this one dude who's very charismatic, is able to project power really well, and they usually pick up downtrodden people who just want to feel like they're part of a community. So they find a cult, feel like part of a community. But the trade-off there is they have no power, they have to go with what this lunatic says, and it always goes badly, because you're doing what a lunatic says to do, right? I would imagine a lot of that's going on in this show. So again, what's interesting though, apart from the covering up the fact that he's gay, and again, that's interesting. Apart from that, it's the idea that and again, I'm putting it in a silly way, but on one level, it's kind of like, look, we've heard enough about how crazy white people can be in their cults. Let's look at how crazy black folks can be in their cult, right? Sure. So it's got to be saying something about black culture in particular. It's got to be. And whether or not that factors into this question of the highest sexuality and like what power is in that community, or you see what I'm saying? Like it's got. I think those two have got to be linked, because that's a weird detail too. But it seems like to me, absolutely. Just given Tyler Perry's track record too, and like how he approaches his stuff. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. A little bit? Okay. Good. That sounds weird. I'd like to hear about a cult. Okay.
There's this YouTube video I'd watched about like cults and stuff like that. And they're like,
yeah.
It's interesting to see how like cults relate to like how like people like consider a cult like a cult is basically a religion, is what they were saying. Like,
yeah.
If Christianity could be considered a cult, if you think about it, because like people go to church every Sunday, and they just follow whatever. But then it's like these people have those same types of religions. And it's like interesting to see how people like relate that.
Yeah, I mean,
some extremes in there though.
Yeah. Well, a comedian I made the point once that the primary difference between cults and recognized religions is that religions are older, mm-hmm. right? The people that wrote them are dead. But cults are also a little more extreme, usually, and it almost always ends with people killing themselves, mm-hmm. or what have you. But yeah, it could be worth looking into like how cults are depicted in other cases, just a little bit. I'm not saying it's going to be a big part of your paper, but it could help you think about your show as well. That's interesting. Right. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Is this for like our thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to borrow your brain
Uh-huh.
So mine is just One Direction, the band.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna focus mostly on their earlier things.
Okay.
And
They,
so,
they weren't around for a really long time, were they?
pretty long.
How long are we talking?
So they started in 2010.
Okay.
And I think
Because they broke up at some point.
Yeah, they did. When did they,
I can not tell.
they broke up 2015. So it was
5 years is not a long
5
time.
years. I think 5 years is pretty long. But, so One
My
Direction-
son's 5. Anyway, sorry.
So One Direction was a boy band
Uh-huh.
consisting of 5 teenage boys.
Right.
And so their singing started off on the X Factor, and while it was mediocre,
Uh-huh.
they were marketed for their looks.
Sure.
Being teenage boys.
Right.
And that's what made them grow in popularity.
Uh-huh.
So the media marketed them as teenage heartthrobs.
Right.
Their music videos consisted of like the wind flowing through their hair, taking their shirts off, the normal stuff.
As soon as you said music video, yeah, immediately.
Yeah, you can imagine it on the beach.
Yeah, always.
They're singing about girls.
Are they ever in the rain? They get wet, right? Yeah, they get wet.
Most
Okay.
likely. But like I said, most of their earlier songs consisted of love songs with mildly suggestive lyrics.
About like bubblegum or something.
Even though most of their audience was younger girls, like.
Well, that's why it can be mildly suggestive and not explicit.
So that was kind of the persona that media put on the band.
Uh-huh.
Was while we don't know like how they really were, these young teenage boys were marketed as like heartthrobs,
Yeah.
kind of sensual boys, and so
That phrase is disgusting.
yeah, it's like it's weird to sexualize
Yeah.
young teenage boys, but that's
Sure.
how they were marketed.
Well, and we do it to young women as well. Probably, I mean, more often, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of what I want to focus on.
Sure.
How media uses the sexualization of young men to masculinize them.
In a very particular way.
Yeah.
Well, given what you said, one thing that really jumps out at me is I'm having a lot of trouble getting the phrase "sensual boys" out of my head, actually. But that could be part of your title. That's really it really grabs your attention. This idea that they have suggestive lyrics, especially early on, but it's like concealed in a way. Can you think of any and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Can you think of any examples?
There was their song "Rock Me." Where it's
Uh-huh.
like, I want you to rock me, you know.
Right.
Stay up all night, you know.
What all night? Stay up.
Stay up all night.
Doing what? No, I know, but I'm asking.
You forget.
I'm asking about the lyrics
It's
because I don't know their songs.
it's okay. It's like
Does anybody else know? They were kind of popular, and I don't.
When I was younger, it was like really cool to hate on them.
Sure. Well, you were a young man. You're
I
not
had
supposed
a
to.
poster of one of the band members.
Uh-huh.
And I'd like stare at it.
Sure.
And I
No,
was like 10.
I grew up with a younger sister. She was really into. We grew up doing Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, so that was.
And I brought them into it too because they were also marketed as
Yeah, no, it's really old to.
like
Yeah.
shirtless men.
I mean, I would be careful bringing in other boy bands. I think one boy band would be enough. Because by doing that too, I mean, limit your focus in a weird way. Even with One Direction, they're only around for 5 years. Whether or not you feel like that's a long time. How many albums did they have?
They had 5, but I think
It's a lot of albums.
I think 4 with each member. I think the 5th one.
What's his face had left already?
Zayn, yeah.
Okay, so I would even think about, and it sounds like you're kind of doing this, think about ways to focus your conversation down even further. So I wouldn't even I definitely wouldn't take on their discography, but you don't have to necessarily limit yourself to one album either. You could, for instance, pull lyrics from a small handful of songs, and maybe it spans their discography. I mean, that depends, right? But a song lyric here and there is going to still allow you to focus, right, on what because you're talking about what their image is in the public eye. Apart from that, I do know what they're getting at, so I'm looking for something in my pocket, but I can't. Here it is. Small thing. I think one of my sons broke my finger. And it's part of it, but it's been killing me for like 2 months. I finally just started putting this on there. That's what I don't want you to think I'm being gross and this is like a used Band-Aid. It's not. That's why I'm saying all this. Okay. Anyway, I'm curious about the song "Rock Me" because if you're gonna say a thing like, it is obviously very suggestive, but it would still help to point to, like for instance, in that song, I would wonder, do they try to explain this question of rocking in a different way? One of the classic ways would be in terms of like rock and roll, like the whole name of that genre is like, well, you're rocking, you know, you're like dancing, and it's like, yeah, but it's like, that's not really what they're talking about. I think we all know that. And then it's also the question of, we all know that, well then why are we concealing it, right? Like that's the big question at the heart of what you're talking about. One theory, one idea would be something like, we don't want to sexualize young boys, not least of which because our daughters are the ones being sold to, right? Like that's how it works. Well, that means inherently you're sexualizing your daughter. No, they're doing that. But we're okay. What you're actually saying is we are okay with it as long as we don't have to admit it openly, right? Like explicitly. Trick my daughter into being sexualized. Trick me, allow me, it's a phrase, plausible deniability. Like if someone were to approach me and be like, you know, One Direction is like basically hitting on your daughter via song, right? And you're like, no man, it's just about rocking, you know? What's the big deal? Like it gives you an out. When we all, again, know that that's not really the case. Like it seems like a lot of what you're going to be talking about is that, and how, I'm trying to draw on any knowledge I have of One Direction. I have none, but I don't even know their names. But again, it's a well-trodden path that they're on. That's been going on since at least, you know, Elvis, which is very old. But the idea that maybe even I guess one question you could think about, you may not answer this, this may be too big for this kind of paper, is like, why is that the move to sexualize? In this case, young men, but again, we do it to young women too. I mean, it's always the move, isn't it? Like almost no matter what, but in this case in particular, absolutely. Is it partially because that's the only marketable attribute? I mean, you said their singing wasn't great to begin with on whatever show it was. Are we admitting that we're not really interested in substance? We're only interested in, like, you're not just talking about this one boy band necessarily, but like the machinery of celebrity, basically, and what it consists of. And yeah, there's not a lot of singer-songwriters, you know what I'm saying? There's not a lot of, oh, but his lyrics are so good. Like, we're not really interested in that. Does that help?
Yeah, I also was like looking at articles.
Okay.
Tell me if this is like too far away
Okay.
from like, what the subject is.
Sure.
But there would be like moments like Harry Styles when he's 18 dated a 37 or 32-year-old. There was a 14-year like age gap. And
Yeah.
people started calling him a womanizer. And then they
Okay.
were like, how does it feel being like the sex symbol for all these young girls?
Yeah.
When he was still like just a child.
Yeah. What do you know his response was?
He walked away because he was taking pictures of kids. So
That's probably a valid response to that question. Although, to the interviewer's defense, they're not wrong, right? I can't believe I'm going to ask this. Who was he dating that was 32 or whatever?
I think it was
Like a famous person?
Caroline Flack, I think her name was.
Is that a famous person?
Yeah.
Okay. Not to me. Well, what they're implying there, calling him a womanizer, they're implying that he's taking advantage of her. They're implying that he is like a predator, right? And you're correctly sort of pointing out that, like, no offense to anyone, he's still basically a child, right? I know you're 18 and you can like buy guns and smoke, but like that doesn't make you an adult in terms of experience. And we've talked about that. It's interesting that as a young man in particular, this sort of like heartthrob, you kind of wonder if we assume all kinds of things about them, so much so that it can transcend, I think, the typical narrative we would have that like, she's an older woman at the very least, she knows her way around the world better. If anyone's taking advantage of anyone in the situation, it's got to be her. But we're like, no, because I mean, we've seen him on the beach with his shirt off. Like, he knows what he's doing. It's like, I don't know if that's fair. But that, to try to put that all a little more succinctly, it almost, we don't just sexualize these young boys, because we absolutely do, but it is almost like we indict them for what's done to them. Do you know what I mean? Because it seems like you're coming at it from that angle that, like, for the most part, and I think we could all see this pretty easily, they're not the ones deciding how they're going to get marketed. They're along for the ride, so it's not like they're totally innocent, but, I mean, real talk. If somebody said, look, you're going to make X amount of dollars, you just got to get some wind going in your hair and, like, an open shirt on the beach, most of us would be like, where do I sign? But we indict them for that, right? Like, we say, oh, you're in control of this narrative, you're the one. I mean, why is that, right? Like, why do we assume that? That's a harder question, but I think it can be answered, at the very least entertained. Does that make sense? That's cool. That's interesting. It's weird. Yeah, my sister had NSYNC on her wall, for sure. And I was a young boy, and I was like, ew, because again, it's not marketed to me. We'll move on now. That was fun. I love learning about things that I have no idea about, which is usually what happens when you guys bring that stuff up. What we're going to do with the last little bit of class, 2 pieces of business, and then we'll dive into it. Number 1, on the syllabus, it says we're going to talk about annotated bibs. This is that discussion. I'm not going to bring up the prompt. If you've looked at it already, you might have noticed it is familiar, because it's the same prompt, because it's the same assignment, for the most part. I mentioned to you before that the reason I assigned the second paper, I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but the main one is I really feel like it asks you to do half of what I'm going to ask you to do for this paper, all right? Which is not only finding other good sources, but performing analysis, getting them talking to each other, thinking about how they work as part of a larger conversation. That's half of what we're doing here. So paper 2, in a lot of ways, is all about practice, getting that under your belt so you feel a little bit stronger for this paper, okay? Now, of course, as a result of that, that means half of our process is going to require research. That's why we do this assignment again. The primary difference between the bibs last time and this time is that this time, I cannot clear my throat, this time, you do not have a bib on your primary text, okay? So like last time, one of your bibs was about Vonnegut. We're not doing that this time. If you end up rolling Parks and Rec, you're not going to have a bib on Parks and Rec. You're not going to have a bib on One Direction. Like, your primary text is hard to pinpoint, but you know what I'm saying? Like, we're not going to do that. That's what your proposal is going to be. Your proposal is going to work basically as an annotated bib about your primary text. So you're still going to do that work. But now, for the annotated bibs, which aren't due till like next week starting, okay? We got time on these. Those are your secondary sources, articles you might find, or whatever, okay? I assume not, because we've done it already, but are there any questions at this stage about annotated bibs?
Sort of. So
Okay.
Is the proposal due this week?
Yes.
Okay, so
I
the
thought it
annotated
was
bid
due
next week,
last
proposal this week.
Well, no, there was an issue with the prompt, because again, we found out like a week or whatever before school that we had to do this crazy thing where classes are in half, and so then we all had to attack our syllabi. I've been pretty on point. That's like the one place I screwed up. But yeah, the prompt says it was due last week. It's actually due this week. And I apologize for that. But yeah, we have a proposal discussion board on Coursden for this week. That's where you turn that stuff in. And you can also see other people's, you can respond to other people's, so I think that'll help as well.
So are we turning in the proposal and turn it in, or?
No, in the discussion post.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Like I said, again, there's a small issue with the prompt in terms of making it sound a little more official than it is, because that is how we were going to do it up until the change, is how I'm going to refer to it.
Turn in the proposal in the discussion.
Yeah, and like I said, other people can see it, you can see other people's. I feel like that'll help everybody sort of get on the same page. All right, so that's the first bit of business we got to deal with. Second bit of business, and this is going to be the rest of class. which I know isn't a ton of time, but we have enough time. I've graded your second papers, okay? I don't know if you can see them yet. I'm gonna check that on break, which I have break right after this class. But a couple things to know. You can revise the second paper, okay? And this is noted on the syllabus. It's also noted on Turnitin, which is where you turn in revisions. Your revisions are due the 21st of November, okay? You can write that down if you want, but again, it's on the syllabus, it's on Turnitin. That's a ways away, right? Not quite a month, but pretty close. A couple weeks. The reason I do that is because, again, the point of the semester we're in, I feel like for most of us, this is kind of a dead period, a little, like there's a weird gearing up before finals, basically, okay? We don't have a final exam, but you have a final paper, and what I don't want anyone to do is crush the revision for paper 2 and then just totally shit the bed on paper 3, you know, because we will not have time. You cannot revise paper 3. The class is done when you give me that paper, basically, okay? So I give you all this time, though, to kind of look ahead. I feel like in the back we have a planner out right now. Like that's a good way to be. Like sometime this week, look ahead to the best of your ability. Maybe look at your other classes, whatever you got going on in your life, and say, okay, this is when paper 3 is due. Here's where, you know, maybe I have 2 tests this week, and these classes, you know, like look at, get all that out in front of you and say, all right, the revision is due the 21st. I really want to do it. I want to do well, but the 21st ain't gonna work for me for some kind of reason, right? That's possible for some of us. If that's the case, well then my due date is actually the 16th or whatever, right? That's how I would approach it. Figure out, with all this time that we have, that you may not quite have all that time. And you may not be able to work on it for like 2 weeks, right? Maybe you have stuff in those 2 weeks, you know, whatever. Like, all right, well then starting, I'm not good with dates, but starting November 14th or whatever, I'm gonna knock out the revision. I'm gonna spend like a couple really solid days on it, and I'll get it in by this day, and that'll allow me to move on to whatever else I gotta do, right? That's why I give you that much time. What I would not advise, and what somebody will do, is totally forget about it until the 20th. And then, like I was a student, right? I know how it works, I get it. That's not the best way to do it though, and I'm beseeching you to not do it that way. But real talk, the people that revised the last paper, there might have been a very, very, very small handful of folks that didn't do better. In general, especially if you give yourself enough time, people do better on these revisions. So I advise everyone to do so. But on that note, we're going to talk a little bit about revisions. So, I sent you an email this morning, or I shared a document with you, but you should have an email about it. It's just 2 paragraphs, so you would please open that up on some kind of device. I'm going to have it up here as well, but the body paragraph especially is going to be too long. You won't be able to look at it on the screen. What we're looking at while you're pulling it up, this is the introduction and the first body paragraph from one of your classmates' second papers, okay? I'm going to keep it really, really simple today because I only want to highlight primarily 2 issues, and they were prevalent enough and damning enough to set aside class time to do this, okay? So your directions are this. We're going to go paragraph by paragraph, so we're just worried about the introduction for now. Read through the introduction, and to the best of your ability, I want you to suss out what is the biggest problem. There's going to be small issues. Everybody has small issues. We're not worried about those. What is the biggest problem in this paragraph? Take a couple minutes. Maybe that's a sign. Does anybody need more time? I'll take your silence as a no. Okay. So in this boring game show that I've set up for you, does anybody feel like they have a beat on what's like the biggest issue with this paragraph? Yes, sir.
He didn't say nothing the entire time. It's like a banal claim, like all the way from the top to the bottom.
Why
He
do
just
you-
summarized. When it just him, like he basically said everything that like I guess it is an informative like paper, but like he just talked about the book. Like he didn't really like get to a point, and then he just started like talking about like remarking upon chapter 2.
Yeah, one, and we're gonna talk about the next paragraph, here in a minute, but, I hate that this feels like a game show. The hint I will give you, or kind of offer you about what you're saying is, yeah, I mean, you could definitely argue that some of what we say about Vonnegut maybe isn't super necessary. I think they have some points though, right? Like this, a lot of what they're saying about like glorifying war and things like that, like, I think that's pretty good. I don't mind that. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you to a point. Anyone else have any thoughts on this?
So like the one we talked about on the source,
Why do you feel like that's a problem?
because wasn't the whole point of we learned about the idea, not just the book in general?
Sure. So, what might we do to address that, do you guys think? It's a really easy fix.
I guess not start off saying we've already, or just talk about Slaughterhouse-Five.
I mean, you can and probably should absolutely talk about Slaughterhouse-Five, right? I mean, spend a lot of time on it, you know, but what else might you do?
Introduce the rest of the text, I guess.
Bring in some other guys, yeah. It's an informative synthesis. And yes, Vonnegut, for most of your papers, and in a lot of cases rightfully so, figures largely. We talked about it a lot, he says a lot. So absolutely, you can talk about him right up front, most of the time if you want, to a degree. Yeah, but it's synthesis. If we're only talking about one text, we can't perform synthesis. It's impossible. We're trying to present a conversation between these texts, right? So we need other texts. There's a really easy spot to do it. Ooh. And this is what I mean by it's an easy-ish fix, okay? Where did I pinpoint it for myself? Right here. So we say, we're talking about glorifying war. Vonnegut shows how boys and young men were manipulated by that mechanism, right? Okay, cool. We have a specific idea from Vonnegut about glorifying war, this kind of narrative that's maybe unrealistic, right? How young men will buy into that. Okay. Do any of our other texts talk about that at all? This idea of like depicting war unrealistically and young men buying into it and all that. Short answer is yes, by the way.
You talking about Little Boy?
God, no.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Could you use Jarvis for that?
Sure. Why do you think so?
It's because she had that one instance where she was talking about her, how the movie was being shown in like one of her dad's room.
Sands of Iwo Jima.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Jarvis. You know? Something like that. It's that easy. Last name, what they have to say about it, and all of a sudden you're beginning to perform synthesis, right? You have two texts, you're holding them next to each other. In this case, you're saying they agree, but Jarvis is a little bit different, and here's how. And you just kind of go from there. If another text comes in somehow as part of that conversation, well, then you bring it up there, right? Or if you have a different but related idea, then you could bring it up and involve another text. Like, it builds organically. So not all of your papers are going to work exactly like this. But again, the mechanism is the same. And especially in the introduction, when you're going to be a little bit general, because that's how introductions work, what are the big ideas you talk about in your paper? How, hopefully, do you get your text involved with each other? We got to see that in the introduction. You got to bring them up. Okay. Next one.
Do we need 4 sources for the
What's up?
next paper?
What happened?
Do we need 4 sources again?
Oh, for paper 3, you have your primary source, and then, man, numbers are hard for me. I believe The prompt calls for 4 secondary sources. So you would have 5 total, counting your primary text. I believe that's true. I'm not 100%. I'm like 95% certain. But it's on the prompt. Okay, same deal. So real quick, again, you'd be best served by looking at this on a device because we can't show all this on screen. But read through their first body paragraph if you would. And all we're interested in, once more, what is the big issue here? There's going to be some smaller ones, but what is the primary issue? Take a minute. All right, now some of you finish up. We've read enough to get this one, hopefully. What do you think the primary issue here is? There's going to be small stuff. There's a big problem in this paragraph.
I couldn't find a second source. It was just talking about weird names all the time.
So the bigger issue is that, but that's also, we can talk more about that, but addressing that is going to help us do that, okay? I'm sorry for pointing to everybody. I'm about to do it again. No, the biggest issue, because this is just like a cardinal sin of just like any paper you would ever write for me, is there's so much summary. There's so much that real talk, there is some analysis here. There is, but it is buried. You almost miss it sometimes because there's so much summary, just swallowing it up, okay? It really gets in the way. And it also takes up a lot of space that we could use. So I'm just going to cut a good bit of it. I'm not going to necessarily get all of it. I just want to show you. So definitely from here. Oop, going too fast. Slow down. Let me see. Cut that. And then we got to trim this. You say that already. Okay. So that's our first quotation. Now we're taking too long to get to it, so we need to trim this. I could lose more of this. All right, I'm almost done, I promise. All right, and then we could also lose, where's the next bit? We kind of do it throughout. There's one big section at the end we got to lop off. And then through here somewhere. Yeah. Oh, the good news about losing this one, this is a very small point. We can cut this Britishism. A lot of you have this weird idea that talking like a British person occasionally makes you sound fancy. It doesn't. None of us are British, which is weird. No one says whilst. Or what are some of the other ones you guys will do? It's always ST. You know it when you do it. Anyway, we don't talk like that. That's not how we speak. Don't do that. Anyway, all right. So there's a few smaller bits of summary that we honestly don't need. But I got the big chunks, okay? Now I want you to see the difference in that paragraph, just on the page, right? It's still kind of long because we do say some stuff, right? I want to look at this quotation. I know we're almost out of time. But in the story that Weary tells himself, he's going to be congratulated as part of the 3 Musketeers. This person is going to tell them that they're all going to get bronze stars. Okay, that's our quotation. And after that, we do have some analysis. We talk about a heroic war story. They go on to say, I mean, again, there's a little bit of summary we could trim. Oh, but right here. Weary has this fantasy of being a war hero and the glory that comes along with it. That's the start to some analysis, okay? But there's 2 things we've got to add to that, and it's on either side. And I think doing the first part is going to help us with the last part, and then I'll let you go, okay? The first part is we're missing that middle step. All right, what I mean is, when you take evidence, when you say, congratulate the Three Musketeers, Weary's one of those people, telling them that they're all going to get bronze stars. We go from that quotation to a thing like, Weary thinks he's owed some kind of glory. You got to tell me how we get to that step based on that quotation. So just here for a minute, like literally for a minute, I'm going to ask you, can you prove to me, can you explain to me with this quotation how we end up talking about glory or praise for somebody like Weary?
Congratulations and a bronze star.
How so?
Because I guess that's like you're being rewarded something for doing something.
You get a medal,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, absolutely. You see how easy that was? It's not on the page. I assume the student knows that, right? I assume, because I mean they got there, but it's in their head, it's not on the page. That's one missed opportunity. Another one is this, the Three Musketeers. You guys have heard of them. Almost none of you know the story, because it's an 18th century French novel, but it's famous enough that you've heard of it. That's a pretty big deal. He's equating himself to that, right? He's on the same level as the Three Musketeers in his own mind, right? That's almost like mythological status, right? Does anyone else, in any of the other texts we've looked at, think about young men, maybe with unrealistic expectations, putting themselves on some kind of crazy pedestal, almost like the Three Musketeers, when it comes to war? Three Musketeers, by the way, first of all, 4 of them, spoiler, but they fight against like a tyrannical government, they overcome these great odds, you know. It's an action movie before we had movies. Any of our other texts talk about that in some kind of way? Again, the short answer is yes.
Was it Vonnegut talking about like the wars from the movies?
With Mary? We could do that. I mean, this is still Vonnegut here, but absolutely, yeah.
Or was it Jarvis, I'm sorry, talking about the war movies, like how they stationed
It could be both of those if you wanted to. Sure. It's almost like this is that conversation we were trying to have in the introduction, right? And again, this is an opportunity for synthesis, but I want to state this to you explicitly, and then I will let you go. The reason we could not perform synthesis, number one, is because our analysis was buried. So there's way too much summary. Way too much summary, okay? And that makes it hard for you to see it, okay? To find your analysis. But also, once you trim all that away, you see where your analysis is. Now you get to say, all right, am I filling in logical gaps? Am I spelling out how I'm arriving at certain ideas? And you do that for 2 reasons. Number one is, just like math class, you got to show your work. I have to see your work. But number 2, in this particular paper, when you do that, you give yourself opportunities for synthesis. Once you spell out, well, he thinks he's owed this medal according to this narrative. It goes all the way back to the Three Musketeers. He's going to be this hero. It's like, yeah, does that sound like anybody else ever? Oh, yeah, it's those fucking guys in that movie thinking they're all going to be John Wayne, right? And all of a sudden you can bring in Jarvis now, and you can talk about, again, how this idea manifests itself in the real world. And now that conversation has a whole other layer to it. But it's almost impossible to perform synthesis without that step. I promise. You gotta focus on details. You have to. Otherwise, you're just holding things up next to each other and you're asking me to make that connection. But it's like, that's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. I think a lot of you are. It's just not on the page. Okay? So there are other issues that other people had. But these are the 2 biggest ones that I saw. Okay? Any questions about any of that before I let you go? Okay. Like I said, I encourage everyone, it's not compulsory, but I encourage everyone to do the revision. Bear in mind that's not due this week. We got a minute on that. What is due this week? Your proposal discussion. That's due on CourseDen. I want you to respond to 2 people. I want you to look at each other's works. I think that'll help as well. Other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.